Welcome everybody to the Healthy Soil Workshop webinar here at the Grow Together webinar. And we want to thank everyone for coming up. We're going to be joined by a team to do the latest research in the New York City farms and gardening, and how soil and compost set the stage for gardening and farming success through our healthy product soil. The project team will also discuss practice in keeping soil commitments away from people and crops. Please stay tuned for the presentation. Hannah is an executive associate from Cornell University, where she coordinates healthy soil, healthy communities, and other programs. She works together with gardeners farming community gardens. We're going to have two translators also. Perl is the leader of the soil of people who work with the teams She used biotechnology and practice actions research methods in studying bacteria and fungus communication in a newly constructed soil and coalition with many experts outside the amendment of. She contacts experience and always urban soil can manage climate change, promotes healthy food justice, and supports BIPOC leaders, movement in justice and liberty. So welcome all, Hannah and Perl. The board is yours. Feel free to, if you have any questions or answers, please put them in the chat and they will be answered at the end of the session. And this is a recorded session.
Great, thank you so much, Lillian. Thank you, Casey, Mara. I think I saw Carlos on here. And I want to thank all GreenThumb staff for hosting an incredible conference for so many years. We're so sorry that we can't be there with you in person, but we're really glad that you're doing this remotely. So we're honored to be here. And as Lillian introduced, Hannah and I are going to share some research updates that have been gathered over the past, as well as some new research, and hope you enjoy it. And of course, put your questions in the chat and we'll hope to revolve our presentation around your questions. So today we're going to talk about how we grow healthy soils. We're going to have a land acknowledgement, talk about healthy gardening practices, and gardening in the time of COVID-19. We'll also talk about clean soil and compost, and then tell you about a new project called Ag Soils of the City. It's a project Hannah and I are working on with a lot of other researchers at Cornell, as well as mostly farmers, not just gardeners. A lot of our work focuses on gardeners specifically, but we're going to share with you some updates from this project as well. So the goals and activities, preliminary results, and then we hope to have a discussion. So I want to start by saying that we want to acknowledge this presentation. We want to begin this presentation by acknowledging that those of us in New York City are in Lenape-Hoking. This is the Lenape homeland, and we want to acknowledge the Lenape community, Lenape elders of the past and present, and their future generations to come. So I was born and raised on the unceded land of Wappinger and Lenape peoples, known as the Bronx. Today I'm presenting to you from the unceded land of Canarsie and the Lenape peoples, known as Brooklyn. Hannah's presenting from the traditional homelands of the Cayuga Nation, members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, where Cornell University and surrounding areas are now located. So many of the institutions that we are part of were founded on exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. And so I invite all of us to commit to the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism in all of our education, research, and I should say growing endeavors. That being said, I also want to acknowledge that we are so grateful for every single community gardener in New York City and beyond. So you are at the forefront of leading urban sustainability and environmental justice, supporting access to fresh produce, food sovereignty, physical activity for participants, space for community building and cultural exchange, use of abandoned lands, and reduced waste. And improved air and water and many other ecosystem services. So thank you for all of the work you do every day. And I think it's also important to notice that Black Lives Matter and that it is Black, Brown, Indigenous, Latinx, all kinds of communities of color that have led these movements for so long. So we just want to thank you and acknowledge that. So right now, if you have a few minutes, and you can do this throughout the presentation, we're curious to know what questions bring you here today. So if you can let us know what you're curious about, we'll hope to respond to that. So we might be able to see a few coming in, but I don't know if I can see the chat while I'm presenting. But we'll definitely address it by the end.
I'm also happy to keep an eye out for any responses in the chat and any questions that come up. So one question or one response so far is how to get abandoned soil safe to grow in.
Great question. Okay. Good. So we'll note these like we will definitely address that kind of question. So keep them coming. And with that, I'll pass it over to Hannah.
Excellent. Thank you, Pearl, and thank you all for being here this evening. This is fantastic, and it's great to see so many of you joining us. And yeah, and that question about how to deal with abandoned soils and start a garden, that's a perfect segue to what we're going to talk about next. So it was fantastic. And as we think about what we want to do here, let's start with what we know when we're thinking about urban farms and gardens and growing in urban environments. And we know that we have so many benefits of urban gardening and farming. Pearl just outlined those. And we really want to set everyone up to enjoy the benefits and the successes of growing food in urban environments and minimizing the risks that exist because we don't always know exactly what happened on our soils. What we do know is that the presence of contaminants like lead from the past use of leaded paint, leaded gasoline, incineration industry, other sources, and there's some other contaminants to think about as well, that because humans have done a lot of things in a lot of spaces, we sometimes have a legacy of those past decisions. So we want to be thinking about where we're growing our food and what we're growing it in. Because as people are working in soil and playing with soil, children and adults, we can come in contact with any contaminants that might be mixed in with those soil particles. And potentially, we could also come in contact with toxins or contaminants that make their way onto or into our garden-grown foods. So our goals here are building healthy urban soils, because it's important for the ecosystem and all the many reasons that we talked about. And also we want to think about how we can keep contaminants away from our food and out of our bodies so we can be as healthy and successful as possible. Next slide, Pearl. This is a resource that some of you may have seen if you have interacted with our Healthy Soils, Healthy Communities project before. And this is kind of our short and sweet version of our recommendations for what gardeners can do, getting right down to our best practices for healthy gardening and the steps that we can take. This resource is available on our website, which is blogs.cornell.edu/healthy soils. I think we'll share a link in the chat and with the conference resources as well. And what we're going to do for the next little chunk of time is to go through these recommendations and kind of share them, but with some context from our past and recent research, as well as some community projects that we've been involved with. And again, keep the questions coming. If there are any brief clarifying questions, I'd be happy to answer them as we go through, but we're going to try to save a chunk of time for a Q&A at the end. All right, next slide, Pearl. Thank you. All right, using clean soil and compost. And Pearl's going to talk a bit later about some programs in New York City that are helping us to get clean soil and compost to gardeners, including the New York City Clean Soil Bank, and how we can meet this need for growing in material that we can feel confident and safe producing food in. So we know that by growing in clean soil, this helps to keep contaminants away from our food and away from our bodies. And it's also a step towards building healthy urban ecosystems. We know that organic matter dilutes contaminants. If you're adding more good stuff, then the less stuff gets mixed in, and overall you've got more material that you can feel confident about. Organic matter helps to make toxic metals less available to be taken up by plants. It kind of binds it there in the soil. And it has other benefits for just improving the structure and the fertility and the health of the soil. And it keeps dust down, which is important for making sure that we're not having contaminants in the air that we're breathing in or getting on our food. And I'm imagining we're going to get some questions from some of you about how much soil and versus compost we should be adding. And that's an area where we've done some research, and there's more research ongoing as we try to figure out exactly what does this look like on a very practical level for people that are either starting a new garden or have an existing garden and want to understand how they should be amending their soils over time. So lots of opportunities there. Next slide, thanks. So using raised beds. This one is a really simple recommendation, but there's some nuance to sort through as well. And overall, the recommended best practice for green thumb gardens and most other situations is to grow in raised beds. Often that looks like a lumber framed bed with soil or compost put inside it. In some situations, there are alternatives to growing that could look like clean materials separated from any potentially contaminated soils in some other way. So think mounds of clean soil, or possibly a larger area that has a barrier put down and clean soil and compost brought in. That's really going to depend on the site and the recommendations for wherever you are. As we're thinking about what we're going to make our beds out of, we want to avoid treated wood. Treated wood that you can buy currently no longer is going to have arsenic in it the way that it did in the past, but it does still contain chemicals that we don't always know much about. So one thing to mention is our project actually has some new outreach videos on safe versus unsafe bed materials that are coming out this spring. So you can keep an eye on our Healthy Soils website for a link to those. And if anyone has questions about specific building materials or how-tos of constructing beds, we can get to that in the Q&A. But basically, we just want to think about growing our plants somewhere where we can be confident in their soil. Thanks, Pearl. And this is bed building in action. This is Pearl and some youth community members pre-COVID working on a bed building project at NYCHA Ravenswood. And you can see the beds coming together here. And I'm sure Pearl can answer any specific questions about materials used if anyone has questions about that. But you can see the structure really nicely. And a note here that's a really nice follow-up on the previous session about record keeping. Keeping track of your process and organizing your information as you're going through it can really save a lot of time and potentially concern down the road if the issue of contaminants does come up. If we know that what's in there was put there with care and either tested or brought in from a trusted source, then we can feel confident moving forward that we don't need to start back at square one. So keep records somehow, especially if you're part of a garden where there might be some leadership transitions and new people coming in. All right, next. Covering or mulching soil helps to keep soil particles off of our fruits and vegetables and away from people. If you think about if you had dry, dusty areas, all those particles are going to get blown around by the wind or kicked up as people are walking or as you're digging. And we want to keep that dust down. What our team's research and what others have found is that, particularly for lead, most of the lead that we're finding on our vegetables is really on them. It's not getting taken up through the roots. It's rather being contaminated from soil particles that are moving from around the garden. And we also have found that those particles aren't even necessarily coming from right where the plant is growing. Sometimes they're coming from other areas of the garden where the particles are kind of getting blown around. So the more we keep that dust down, the more we're being careful to keep our plants safe. And our project did some research trials in New York City and also in Ithaca. We transported New York City soils to Cornell University to do some field trials in a rural site compared to the urban community garden plots. And the goal is to really understand how contaminants are moving around and how we can try to keep those contaminants like lead off of our vegetables. So basically we grew lettuce in both low lead and high lead soils. And we had different plots with different treatments. There were basically little pots to grow our lettuce in, and sometimes there was just bare soil. Some of the crops were covered with like a little mini hoop house, just built a little covering to keep anything from above falling onto those plants. And other plots had mulch. So there was the soil surface was covered in a bark mulch. And overall, the important takeaway here was, again, reaffirming this idea that most of the lead gets on leafy crops in particular through splash. So as we're watering our crops, as there are rainfall events, and those soil particles get kind of, knocked out of place and bounce up onto the plants. And so really what this means for gardeners is that what we can do is we can grow in clean soil in the first place. Little graph here, you can see we have a lot less lead in our lettuce that was grown in low soil, and considerably more in lettuce that was grown in higher lead soil. And we see that most of that lead came from splash. So if we can do things like mulch and covering our plants and covering bare soil, then we can keep those soil particles off of the crops, and particularly the contaminant particles. And really it's covering the soil that matters. We recognize that a little mini greenhouse might not be the best fit for all gardeners, though it's certainly something you could try if you have the means. Next slide. All right, so soil pH. Really what we want to remember here is that keeping pH near neutral is best for most garden plants anyway. And it has a happy added benefit of helping to keep most contaminants from being taken up by the roots. This graph is just trying to show us that it's important to remember that different metals behave differently in soils. With all of them, we still do better when we stay right around neutral. But it is just a bit of a lesson in the more we can do some detective work and learn as much as we can about our own soils, or just be confident in bringing in clean soil and clean compost to grow in. But neutral pH. Next. And thinking about our kids, often we have play areas in or near our gardens, and putting down a barrier in clean materials can really help to keep our kids safe. And I really want to stress that we want our kids to play outside. We want them to be playing in the soil and getting dirty and learning by being out there. But if we can just do all that we can in order to feel confident that we're having our kids play in areas that have clean materials as much as possible. And we're mentioning kids because lead is particularly harmful to the developing brains of young children. Next. And some simple kind of common sense hygiene practices help a lot as well. Washing our hands, particularly before we would eat or smoke, or these days put our mask on or off. Anything where we're getting close to our face can really help a lot. Wearing gloves, and being careful not to track soil in on our shoes, on our pets, on our garden tools, and on our vegetables, which we will elaborate on that in the next slide. Washing produce and peeling where appropriate is, again, a really simple thing you can do that helps a lot. Ideally, we want to be growing a variety of crops that we love growing, that we love eating. And by growing in clean soil, that gives us the go-ahead to do that safely and without concerns. If we do have some concerns about our soil, it can be helpful to know that fruits and vegetable fruits, so by vegetable fruits, I mean things like squash and tomatoes that are the fruiting part of the plant, but that we typically think of as a vegetable, beans. Those crop types are less likely to get contaminants on or in them. And if they do get some soil particles on them, they can be a lot easier to wash off. Whereas and the plant is really good at keeping anything from getting taken up into the root and move through the plant and into that fruiting part. If you think about how that's different from something like a carrot or any other root crop that's growing in the ground, those root crops are right there next to the soil. And also anything leafy, like leafy greens or herbs, they're a bit more likely to get soil particles on them, and they can be harder to wash off. They've got lots of surface area, and a lot of them are kind of wrinkly and can trap those soil particles that might have contaminants carried with them. All right, next slide. And this is also some of our newer research on the importance of washing crops. And the overall message here is really that any washing is considerably better than none at all. you can see on the graph that there's that one little rectangle that stands out above the rest. And those are the unwashed lettuce samples that were the only ones that exceeded health-based guidance values for leafy vegetables. All our other washing treatments, which we did a water rinse, a water soak, a commercial veggie wash, and a vinegar rinse or wash, those all did much, much better than not washing at all. So, we saw that the commercial veggie wash and the vinegar did slightly better than just plain water, but really it was a nice clear message here that washing is best, plain water is just fine. Just make sure you're washing as well as you can to get those visible soil particles off. Okay, next. And healthy gardening in the time of COVID. So just a bit of a recap here and a few extra notes about gardening in the time of COVID-19. And the context for putting together this spin on it was, starting last spring, we were hearing from a lot of people who were starting new gardens because they had the time and interest, and the need for locally grown food was just becoming increasingly more pressing. And so really, we just want to emphasize to remember to grow in clean soil and compost. And also just a note that it's harder than usual to get soils tested right now. There are some options, but some labs have been closed, there are longer wait times, and it's really been touch and go in terms of availability of testing. So again, do your best to get some clean soil and compost if there's any chance that you need it. And GreenThumb is certainly a resource for that for GreenThumb gardeners. We talked about the importance of covering areas of bare soil and of washing vegetables. And then of course, just the extra COVID considerations, which I'm sure many of you have dealt with, and remembering just as we adapt our gardening practices to be sure that we're having safe social distancing in our gardens and being cautious about things like sharing tools and supplies. Next slide. And again, access to everything from soil testing to resources like soil and compost has been limited at times and plentiful at others. So really, we just recommend calling labs and suppliers for the latest information. And if anyone is looking for particular resources, we're certainly happy to try to help, though, often it's really got to check with the source. Cornell has put together some resources specifically to COVID-19 and also more general gardening resources, recognizing the need for this information, particularly right now. And so there's a few links here, and the link on the bottom there is our Healthy Soils, Healthy Communities website, and you can access those other links through our page. So check out that Healthy Soils, Healthy Communities page if you're looking for any information. And my email will be at the end of the presentation as well. You could feel free to reach out directly. And I think we'll pass it on to Perl.
Thanks so much, Hannah. So Hannah mentioned one contaminant of pressing concern all over the world, lead. And people always have questions about this element, really because it's so common. It was used in so many different parts of industry and manufacturing, notably leaded paint, leaded gasoline. So it's all over the globe. So what do we do about it if it's there? And there's many other contaminants that we have to deal with, but lead is the most common. So what do we do? People often ask, can you remove it from soil? We got this question, how do you make soil better from an abandoned lot? What if there's lead there? Can you take it out with the use of plants? And often I try to see who's in the room, and people have often heard of this, show of hands. Who hears that sunflowers can remove lead? Sometimes, usually people say they have, and I have terrible news for you. Sunflowers will not do the trick. We love sunflowers. They're wonderful plants, but they will not remove your lead. Sorry to say, not on human timescales, maybe in like a couple 100 years, not safely. So don't plant sunflowers thinking you'll remove lead. Good news is that crops are usually safe, as Hannah mentioned. They're not taking up that much lead from the roots, but dust can land on surfaces, so be careful. Okay, you can't remove lead with plants. Can you add amendments? How about that question? Can you add amendments like compost? You can change the form of lead, make it less bioavailable. Amendments like compost are great to add to soil. They can be really helpful, but it's tricky. It's not going to remove the lead. It can dilute the lead, right? You can change the total amount of lead that's there. It can even bind with the lead potentially, but compost can make arsenic more available in that graph that Hannah showed, especially the phosphorus in compost. So it's a good idea to add your compost, not too much, but it's not going to fix your lead issue. Okay, so can you dig it up and remove it? You can absolutely do that, especially if money's no constraint. You got a couple extra millions lying around, like go ahead, remove all your soil and put it in a toxic landfill. But that's very hard to do and logistically challenging, especially in cities. So can you cover it? And here you see landscape fabric. That's really your ticket. Abandoned lot question. You can test all you want if you can, but there's probably contaminants virtually all over the surface of our globe. So good thing to do is build new soil and cover it. Okay, so where do you get new soil? That brings us to the New York City Clean Soil Bank. And back in 2014, we started a pilot study with the Mayor's Office of Environmental Remediation, who created this Clean Soil Bank. And really, they call it a soil bank. It is the Clean Soil Bank, but they're sediments. That means they're minerals, like sand, silt, and clay, essential components of soil, but it's really just broken down rocks. But they found that they have all these sediments they have access to from new development sites that are perfectly clean, never been touched by humans. And what we did was we mixed it with compost created by the Gowanus Canal Conservancy. We brought them to GreenThumb Gardens and some Brooklyn, Queens Land Trust gardens, did some testing and designs, analysis, and we found that you can make a soil. It's not a naturally occurring soil, but plants love it. So a lot of it depends on what compost you get. We'll talk about that more too, but we have clean, freely available materials to build soil with. So here's what a clean soil bank generating site might look like. This one is Jamaica, in Jamaica, Queens. And you see it's really just sand. And a lot of this was left here by glaciers, some 25,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago. All of Brooklyn and Queens is basically covered with broken down rocks dumped here by the glaciers during the last ice age. And Manhattan and the Bronx are more bedrock. If you go to, you can see them in NYBG, you can see big rock outcrops, and in Central Park, you can see big rocks scraped up by glaciers. But Brooklyn and Queens and all of Long Island, we've got these sediments. So when they've been thoroughly tested, shown to be clean, they can enter this program. And so we've done other pilot studies. We've done a pilot study with East New York farms where they've mixed sediments and compost, distributed them to gardeners. And I want to highlight there's a couple events happening next summer and fall, but you can mark your calendars and you can register online with East New York Farms to go and pick up bags of free constructed soils is what we call them. They're sediments and composts mixed together. And here you see some test beds where we mixed 25% compost, 50% compost, 75% compost, and 100% compost to compare how they grow. So we're doing ongoing experiments, looking at the use of these new soils, but mostly finding that when you've got some compost and you've got around 30% compost, you've got a good growing medium. And in very exciting news for those of us who love giant piles of clean dirt, OER, the Mayor's Office of Environmental Remediation, who created the Clean Soil Bank, has their own stockpile, which never existed. So again, as I mentioned, this program we started working with them in 2014. They've started it in 2013, but they never had a physical place where they held all these clean soils. And now what you see here is this huge stockpile in East New York. And there, you can't see a human for scale here, but they're huge piles of clean dirt. Very exciting. And what they're doing is they're sieving it. They're basically sorting out all these big boulders. These are huge boulders that they're able to take out from the compost so that you can get finely sieved material, mix them with your compost. They're also mixing them with some compost on site. And priorities for residents and growers in East New York, but anyone can request and currently pick up soil. So it's easiest if you've got a truck or you've got some way to bag it. It can be heavy, but eventually, hopefully they have plans to get trucks. So stay tuned for that. And here's their website, which we can share as well. So as I've mentioned, we've got this clean soil bank. There are these sediments, but they've got to be mixed with compost. Here's a little photo from East New York Farms. You can kind of see the layers having separated out between the sediment and the compost. Compost is essential to have clean soils. So, right, these sediments are mostly sand. To make soil, they have to be mixed with compost. And we know creating compost not only reduces waste, helps mitigate anthropogenic or human-created climate change, but it also provides these essential nutrients for creating soil. And as Hannah mentioned, helps limit exposure to soil contaminants. So I'm just also very grateful to the Save Our Compost Coalition, who's really working to help support the efforts of composters all around our city. So you can join this group, get involved. We need composting. And with that, I'm just going to talk about some of the different partnerships that Hannah and I have been a part of and worked with a lot of different folks. So there is the Brooklyn College Urban Soils Lab. I graduated with them and got some graduate degrees, and they should be open for soil testing. They are for the most part, but again, it's, as Hannah mentioned, it's COVID times, things can be delayed, and they have, limited staff hours, but they're there and they're open and doing good work and providing testing. And then there's also been a lot of community members and different organizations, including GreenThumb, that have taken part in the legacy-led consortium. And we helped, create some more info sheets, some signage, best practice guides. And then there's the Healthy Soils, Healthy Communities group that Hannah had mentioned, that's been creating resources for over a decade. And now I'm going to tell you about a new partnership. So we've got the Ag Soils of New York City partnership. And you can go to this website and learn more about what we're doing, but really trying to understand more. Okay, we know how to deal with contaminants for the most part. We know we want to build clean soil, but we don't know all that much about what's actually going on in these new soils. Soils that community gardeners, growers, farmers have been building for a long time. So the aims of this group is to recognize that urban agriculture supports all of these social and environmental benefits that we've been talking about, from food justice to workforce development to ecosystem services. But we don't really know what's happening in these new soils. Science is just catching up to what's happening in already existing soils, right? It's still a relatively young discipline. Like they say that some of our founding fathers of soil science lived in the 1800s. I mean, we haven't been around as a field for that long. And one of our great lived in the US, soil scientist Hans Jenny published the factors of soil forming in the 1940s. We're really just learning about this incredible life-giving material, from the scientific perspective. I think people have known about it for a very long time, but science is just starting to catch up. So science is just starting to learn about all the billions of microorganisms that do everything in our bodies, right? They're responsible for so much in the world, the microbiome. And so we're starting to learn about them in soils as well. So the purpose of this new group, creating research, is to really look at sustainability from the soil up and try to understand more about these new soils and microorganisms. So we started one research project, and we've got some questions, and we're focusing on farms around the city. But some of the farms actually have parts of them as community gardens. But the questions are, what are the characterizations, compositions, and functions of soil biota, the little organisms of soil, in relation to other broader environmental parameters at urban farms in New York City? And what kinds of assessments, what kinds of data are actually meaningful to urban farmers? And how can these data be collaboratively collected and made accessible to broader populations? So we have a number of different phases. And the first phase here is to do a survey. So we've done a survey, we've sampled soils at the root zones of 6 brassica plants, mostly kale, 6 solanaceae plants, mostly either tomatoes or peppers. And we did this at 9 urban farms in New York City. We measured leaf chlorophyll and soil respiration. We analyzed soil biology, chemistry, and physical qualities. And then we've been sharing results with farmers. We're actually just shared some data. Some of the data you're going to see today is hot off the press. We shared some of this data with farmers, and then we're going to have a series of discussions about what these data mean, what they think of them. And we're going to consider the implications of these results, plan some follow-up studies. And after that, we're going to co-create some research together, participatory action research, which means that the expertise is not located in the scientists. The expertise is located in the people doing the work every day with the soils, but we will co-create some designs and some follow-up studies. So here's some of the data we collected. I already mentioned some of it. This little machine right here is really amazing. It helps, it measures soil respiration right there in the field. So you put it down on the soil and it can move up and down and capture the respiration or breathing of the microbes in the plant roots. So we collected plant chlorophyll, soil respiration with this here Lycor, a whole lot of soil physicochemical properties like moisture, pH, bulk density, texture, water holding capacity, organic matter, cation exchange capacity, and salts. We're not going to get into all of that, but we're looking to get a comprehensive understanding of what can we measure with these soils. And then we got some data on soil bacterial and fungal community composition and diversity. We also looked into soil metals. So our first display of results here is organic matter levels. And I'm showing this to let you see that there's, on the bottom, we see 9 different farms and we have a percentage of organic matter. And I don't know if we were in person, I could see hands, like if people are familiar with how much organic matter is on average in agricultural soils. I don't know if you have a sense of that, but a lot of the textbooks say on average, around 5%. 5% organic matter. And we see here, that's the lowest. That's like the very lowest amount of organic matter we would have in any of these farms in New York City. We always have a lot of organic matter, which comes from compost for the most part. There could be others, but a lot of it's compost in our cities. And let me just be clear too, that these box plots show, these are called box plots, and the bottom is the minimum value. So you'll see here, this is below 10, could be 8%. Up here is the maximum value above 15, and the dark line is the median value, so like smack in the middle, the median, and then you have the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile, sort of halfway between the maximum and the median and the minimum and the median. So it shows us the sort of spread or the range of data you might find, and we found the most in farm number 4, but it really varied across site. And then what we see, these are our hot off the press data of the bacterial relative abundance. So which bacteria are actually in these soils? These data can be time consuming and expensive to get. So this is the first that we know of on urban agricultural bacterial community composition data, certainly throughout 9 farms in New York City. So what we see here, and important to note that these are not at the species level. So when you think about taxonomy or different levels, you've got the kingdom, order, phylum, class, you've got all of these different levels. This is down at the phylum, sorry, which comes at, yeah, this is at the phylum level. So not the species, this is even more general than the specific species. But what we see, and we'll go through this in a couple more slides, is that there are some variations across farms. These are the farms 1 through 9, but there isn't a lot of variation across the plant type. This is cabbage, kale, peppers, and tomato. And you often think of the plant as driving the relationships with the biota in the soil. And because the plants will let go of all these amazing sugars, exudates from their roots that will feed the microbes. But we see a lot of similarities throughout plant type, but more differences throughout the farms. So now I'm going to go through what are these phylum level bacteria all about? What's some information about them? And what we're going to do is I'm going to just talk about the information that we have about each of these groups. And in subsequent analyses that we're going to do with the farmers, we're going to figure out, okay, well, what does it mean for what's going on at that farm or for broader ecosystem services? But for right now, Proteobacteria, which is the most common, you see upwards of 40% Proteobacteria across our farm. So we've got a lot of those here. What do? Well, we know they're more abundant in high carbon conditions, high carbon, high organic matter, high compost conditions. Okay. And many of them fix nitrogen, which is an extremely important process of taking nitrogen from the atmosphere, making it available to plants. So these are some crucial bacteria, but some of them could also be pathogens. So we'll need to do a little more work to figure out what exactly is going on with Proteobacteria, but we know we've got a lot of them. We've also got Actinobacteria, more abundant in low resource conditions, and that really varied across the farms from 10% to over 20%. Then we've got Bacteroidetes, which are also more abundant in high carbon conditions, sensitive to nutrients. They can help recover soils, and they're beneficial to the nutrient cycling, the nutrients that plants need, especially after a disturbance. So again, this is a huge range here. If you remember, it's interesting, farm 4 had the most organic matter, but the least of these. So then we've also got Acidobacteria, which are more abundant in low pH conditions. So it's more acidic conditions, Acidobacteria. I didn't show you, we have some pretty high pHs. So interesting why we have these acid-loving bacteria in our relatively high pH soils. So something to figure out there. We've got Varicomicrobia, also more abundant in low resource conditions. We got a whole range of Firmicutes. Again, a lot of them are nitrogen fixers, but could be pathogens. So could be good or bad to have. And Plantomycetes, which are more abundant in low resource conditions. So overall, there's clear differences in many different soil parameters across farms. I only showed you 2, organic matter levels and bacterial relative abundance. But we did find for almost all of the parameters we measured, and I gave you that whole long list, it's not seeming to be driven by the type of plant being grown there, but it is, so it's driven by something else. It's not just the plants. We see differences across sites. And now we're starting to figure out, well, what could account for these differences? We think that one part may be site age. We see some differences across the different ages of sites, and the organic matter levels are probably driving these differences. So that comes back to a point we've made earlier that compost is pretty important in our cities and in our soils. So something to think about here. We're finding out with the data that compost is driving, potentially, it's not a finished story yet, but we think that compost may be driving a lot of the differences that we see. So with that, we just want to thank you for joining us. Here's our contact info. We'll share more resources. And now we'd like to hear from you. So we've posed some questions here, but we're also just happy to hear any questions you have.
Great. Thank you so much, Pearl and Hannah. Really appreciate it. I've got some initial questions that folks have already put in the chat, so I'll read a few out loud and continue to feel free to add any questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. One question was about adding a lot of compost. If it raises soil pH, should gardeners add sulfur to compensate, or just like how to manage any changes in pH with adding compost?
So we're hoping to do some experiments on that this coming spring with adding sulfur to change pH of high organic matter soils. It should work, right? Sulfur should lower pH. So if you know you have high pH compost and your pH seems a little high, I would say look into some proper usage rates of sulfur. Sam Anderson and Yolanda Gonzalez from Cornell Cooperative Extension and Urban Agriculture with Harvest New York in New York City have done some good experiments on this already, and are hoping to help with more. So they might be able to help you with application rates of sulfur.
Thank you. There was a question about like materials to use for raised beds. What about using cinder blocks? Cinder blocks, are those safe to use?
Yeah, so that's one of the materials. Yeah, I've got this one. So this will be featured in a new student-led project with some outreach resources that I mentioned. And there's a Cornell student who put together videos on safe and unsafe raised bed materials. So we're hoping to get that on our website this spring. And the short answer with cinder blocks is that there's a distinction between concrete blocks, which are safe because it's an inert material, particularly if they're in good condition. You can put them around your beds and they'll stay there. We should be cautious with cinder blocks, which may have some contaminants in there because they're made from fly ash, which can have things like PAHs, which are a combustion product and can be toxic. And I'm trying to remember, so the easy way, the trick to tell the difference is that concrete blocks are much denser and heavier than cinder blocks. So the ones that feel kind of light and airy, we want to use caution, but if it feels heavy, like a piece of concrete, should be good to go.
That's really helpful to know. That's a good distinction. I did not know myself. So thank you. Pearl, were you
Another
gonna?
thing about, though, is that concrete often has a lot of the same material that lime is made from, calcium carbonate. So it could really raise the pH.
Okay.
So something to be aware of.
It's good to keep in mind for sure. There was some more questions about where to access free compost. If you could maybe speak to that a little bit more. GreenThumb also does do direct deliveries of compost. So I did include some information about that in the chat for any gardens or gardeners that are from registered GreenThumb gardens. But maybe for anyone who may not be part of a GreenThumb garden.
So there's a number of different sites with the New York City Compost Project. Some of them have, or all of them have lost some funding this year. Many of them have regained some funding and are in transition, but you can, I think it's makecompost.nyc should be the DSNY central website for all of that. Or there's a new website from DSNY, Department of Sanitation, that will link to all the different compost projects, and you can find one that's closest to you and reach out to them.
Great, thank you. We also have a couple of questions, like site-specific questions. One was, we've been mixing our compost greens with browns made from tree leaves near a toxic plot. Now that I understand lead dust is a significant problem, should we be using something other than those leaves for the mixture?
Do you want to take that, Pearl, or do you want me to start? You can jump in.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, we don't necessarily have solid data on that, but the biggest concern with tree leaves is particularly if they were swept from the streets, where we tend to just have an accumulation of lead dust just as it gets moved around by traffic. And again, even though we're not currently putting it in gasoline or in new paints, all of this is still kicking around in our cities because of our past choices as humans. And this is not just an urban problem, but in urban areas, we do have a higher concentration of buildings and cars and people. So it's not unique, but there's a greater impact in some areas. So if we're getting our leaves from, collecting them from the streets where there may be also a lot of dust, we should be cautious with that. But it's really going to depend on the specifics of where those leaves came from and, the particular ways in which contaminants moved around in that area. So use caution, not necessarily a problem, but has the potential to be concerning. Pearl, do you want to add anything to that?
Just to add to that, I like to say, if you don't know where the yard waste is coming from and you're putting it in a compost pile, keep it away from the beds where you're growing food or areas where kids play. If you can have a separate compost pile for yard waste and a separate one for, you need your browns and your greens. You do need both, but it's really good to make sure you know that you're keeping contaminants out of that pile. Because as you know, all of that bulk of material breaks down. And so you're left with less finished compost at the end than all of the browns and greens you started with. But the contaminants are still going to be there. So you could actually have the potential to have more concentrated levels of contaminants after the compost is finished if you brought in some contaminated materials. So really good to think about. You're asking the right questions. Oh, where are these materials coming from? Do I really want to put those in my beds? Do we really want kids playing with them, or can they go in the, I don't know, the back area where, you're not so worried about it?
And just one other note there, we want to be particularly careful if we're bringing in materials from elsewhere, because we want to avoid the unlucky scenario where our own site was actually in pretty good shape, and we want to make sure that we're not adding contaminants and making things worse by doing what's supposed to be a really great practice of of composting and using that compost in our gardens. So just thinking about how things are moving around and being as confident as we can with everything that we're using in our gardens and adding to our gardens.
That's all really helpful and good to keep in mind and asking those questions for sure. We got a question about what is the best material to use when building a composting site in a garden?
I guess that depends on your preference. If you're doing a 3-bin system, what you're doing, again, untreated materials, if you're using lumber, would be great for that.
In our Cornell Waste Management Institute website, which is another Cornell program that I'm affiliated with, there's more composting information than you could ever know what to do with. So there's certainly some resources on, best practices for bin building and different system options and all of that. So if anyone needs help navigating those resources, feel free to reach out to me directly.
For sure, and we can also include that in the list of resources that we share. And on the GreenThumb website, we have a composting toolkit with a compilation of resources about composting on site for community gardeners. So we'll include that as well.
Excellent.
Another question, does ground cover like grass or clover help keep contaminants in the dust down?
Sure
Yeah,
does.
absolutely.
Yes, as much ground cover as possible. Clovers are great. They're also great nitrogen fixers. Plant your clover.
Awesome. Okay, well, that was an easy one. Great.
Isn't that great when there's a yes, no?
Especially when things are really complicated, that's satisfying.
Yeah.
Okay. What can we do to mend abandoned soil when we aren't growing food in it?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
What can we do to mend abandoned soil, or maybe soil that is like of lower quality, that maybe isn't being used to grow food or anything edible, but wanting to still improve the quality of the soil, maybe for future use?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to think about how you are using that site. If kids are playing there, if it's a recreational area, if it's a picnic area, the recommendations we gave for covering up soil in one way or another is still just as important. If the goal is long-term improving soil health, bringing in compost or even potentially bringing in a whole bunch of clean soil and clean compost, if that's feasible, could still be something that would be, again, forward thinking and addressing any potential exposures if people are interacting with that site at all.
Mm-hmm. And as we sort of mentioned, that a lot of plants, a lot of contaminants that are toxic to humans can be toxic to plants, but a lot of plants have really good ways to exclude those toxins from entering their roots or their above ground shoots and leaves. So really, if you've got some beautiful ornamentals that you love and you want anything that you want to plant to keep that covered, keep dust down. And if there's contaminants, if you can keep that record, let people know. Mm-hmm. So they don't go digging it up in future years. I don't know about you all, but before I got into all this work, I would just dig below a barrier in a garden and think, well, it's, what could be. And then I learned, oh my goodness, that's not a smart thing to do. So now I know if I see a barrier, oh, don't go below that. I think about that everywhere, but we don't always think about that. So pass that knowledge down, build more soil on top.
Mm-hmm.
And were you able to share a little bit more about the Clean Soil Bank and your work in East New York? I think we've probably got a number of gardeners from East New York joining us tonight.
Wonderful. Well, there's something specific you want to know. I thought I saw a question about the address for that stockpile, and I don't have it off the top of my head, but you can look on their website. I want to say it's like 834 Bell Street, but you would need to request and make a time to go pick it up. But again, there's this big stockpile put together by by the Mayor's Office of Environmental Remediation, and they're open all the time. So that's work with this city agency that is now located or has created a stockpile in East New York. East New York Farms has been doing research with the Clean Soil Bank. They were one of the first 3 sites we partnered with GreenThumb Research in 2014. So East New York Farms has been doing this work for a while and has been offering this clean soil for the past 2 years. they got some funding to create soil and distribute it. So they do have that resource available. And I listed some dates in the summer and the fall when you can go and pick up soils from them. And if you have more specific questions about what that program entails or how to get involved, I'd be happy to answer that. And you can also reach out. I think it's now Taylor who is leading that program with East New York Farms.
Great, thank you. I have a question about the best type of wood for raised beds. You mentioned not having treated lumber, which is really important, but any other recommendations beyond that?
Sure, you can use untreated lumber, which is not the most glamorous option, and it's not going to last forever, but it will last a while. I know here in the Ithaca area, we built some research beds out of a locally sourced locust, which they held up wonderfully well. They're super hard. They're a bit difficult to work with because of that, and can be expensive depending on your source. Anything rot resistance, if it's in the budget, certainly would be nice. I mean, something like cedar, that's out of the reasonable price range for a lot of gardeners. So, you know, often we see people are just going with untreated lumber that you can easily get at any home supply store, and then just, you know, over time you may need to replace those. But Pearl, anything to add to that? You know, what did you use at the Ravenswood site that we saw the pictures of?
Yeah, untreated pine.
Mm-hmm.
And it loses its shine. Even with linseed oil, we put linseed oil on it. You know, it breaks down over time. But safe.
We had a question about rainwater. If gardens are collecting rainwater, are there any concerns about airborne contaminants?
That would depend on your site. And I think especially what's collecting the rainwater, what kind of roof structure do you have funneling that off? If there's some paint on that roof that's peeling, I'd be cautious. But sometimes you can get just right, the zinc sheet. You might have some zinc, but that shouldn't be too much of a problem. Although sometimes zinc, so maybe you can even get your rainwater tested if you're curious. That could be something useful to do, because it's hard. You can't tell by looking all the time.
Yeah, this question has come up, and it's not something that we have data on directly, nor have I seen other research really looking at this. The concern that has come up would be, again, as Pearl's saying, if we're collecting rainwater in a rain barrel and it's washing off of a roof, thinking about what's landing on that roof, because instead of just what was in the rainwater in the first place, we're now kind of washing off and concentrating any dust that's being deposited on that roof. So that may still be levels that are small enough that it's worth the water source, but it'd be nice to have numbers on that. Mm-hmm. And for a particular site, it might be more or less of a concern depending on what's there. Or, you know, is there a building with peeling paint dropping bits of paint onto that roof that are then getting washed into it and then becoming part of your garden system? Something mm-hmm. like that, we'd want to be really cautious.
Right. Are you next to a highway or the railway? Because sometimes this is, you know, the infra have peeling paint as well. So thinking about what's around your site and what's on it and would be blowing in, that can affect that. But then again, yeah, definitely get that tested if you're curious, the water tested.
And I just
provide free water testing, and I hope they still do.
I was just going to add, I saw someone mention in the chat that that's often the only water source other than hydrants. And with all of this, we aim for doing as good as we can and recognizing that sometimes we can't do this perfectly. So anywhere you can pay attention and think about what's coming into your garden and getting near your garden members and onto your food, great. Sometimes we have to compromise and just do what's feasible and what's possible. So it's okay if it's not perfect.
I'll also put some information in the chat and we can send it out afterwards. Grow NYC, one of our partner organizations, has some great information about rainwater harvesting and green infrastructure in gardens. So I will include that so you all can take a look because they're really experts at rainwater harvesting. Another question we had gotten was about using mustard for phytoremediation. If you have any thoughts on that.
So mustards are one of the plants, along with sunflowers, that have been shown in some research to take up more lead than others. I did an extensive review of all of the literature on plants that can take up lead, and they don't take up enough to remediate the garden, not in any human timescale and not in any safe way. So some mustards could take up a little more lead than some other plants, but it's not going to be enough to remove the lead if you've really got a lead issue. And if you've got a lead issue, don't go planting in it and stirring up the dust and doing all of that. So just cover it. So that's my advice there.
There's a lot of questions, helpful questions that GreenThumb is offering. We also have a Slack channel that you can ask more questions because I see we're running short in time. So feel free to use our Slack channel to add questions, and we'll get back to you if we missed any questions whatsoever. So I want to take out this opportunity to thank our facilitators for doing such a wonderful workshop and a presentation for us. Also, our translators, thank you so much for all your help.